During the final months of World War II in Europe, Allied and Soviet forces encountered the horror of Nazi concentration camps. In these death factories, German scientists carried out inhumane and questionable experiments. The world was horrified by what happened in Europe. However, a few months later and thousands of kilometers away, a Japanese scientist, Dr. Shiro Ishii, ordered the destruction of many laboratories located throughout Asia. In these places, Ishii and the scientists under his command carried out countless experiments on human beings, on a level of sadism and brutality that would make Nazi scientists pale. But who was Dr. Shiro Ishii, and what questionable experiments did he do? Why didn't the United States take him to a military trial, just as it did with the German SS scientists after World War II ended in Europe? Shiro Ishii, born in Shibayama, was considered one of the most talented students in the history of Kyoto University. And in 1920, when he was 28 years old, he graduated in medicine and was considered the best in his class. Ishii was commissioned as an Army surgeon first class. His abilities so surprised his superiors that they allowed him to return to college for graduate studies. Here again his teachers were impressed by Ishii's dedication to research, but above all by his fascination with breeding and cultivating dangerous bacterium. 5 years later, Ishii would return to the army with the rank of chief surgeon second class. He was furious because Japan had signed the Geneva Convention prohibiting the use and development of chemical and biological weapons. He thought that if something was bad enough to ban, then it must surely be very effective, and he began an effort to organize a military group within the Japanese army whose goal would be the development of biological weapons. Ishii spent time in Europe and the United States studying the effects on the use of chemical and bacteriological weapons that took place during the Great War. He was amazed and fascinated with the capacity for destruction in the enemy that this weapon generated. Ishii argued with his superiors about the need to create a development program for this type of weapons. He said that the costs of building, manning and maintaining conventional weaponry were too expensive and that using bacteria would be much cheaper. Sadao Araki, Japanese War Minister, and Infantry General Tetsuya Nagata helped Ishii find the financing he wanted. In 1932, with the rank of Chief Surgeon of the Army, he was sent to the southwest of occupied Manchuria, and in this distant place he would begin the atrocious investigations of the 731 Squadron under the command of Dr. Ishii. He and his team worked on trials that combined the microbes that caused some of the deadliest diseases that had devastated humanity: bubonic plague, cholera, typhoid fever, tuberculosis, syphilis, gonorrhea, dysentery, or smallpox. The Dr. Ishii then defined 3 objectives for his research: 1. Intentional infection of diseases. Various prisoners would be subjected to infection with lethal pathogens. In this way, scientists could evaluate their effects on the human body in real time. A former member of Unit 731 described the process. As soon as the symptoms were observed, the prisoners were taken from their cells and taken to the dissection room, placed on a table. Screaming, the prisoners tried to defend themselves. The prisoner was tied up, still screaming horribly. One of the doctors stuffed a towel into his mouth and then, with a quick cut of the scalpel, opened him up. Without anesthesia, the victims let out horrible screams when the first cut was made, and the screams stopped shortly thereafter. Another member says, "I was working with a pregnant victim who woke up from anesthesia while I was vivisecting her. The woman told me, 'It's okay, you can kill me, but please save my son's life.'" But Dr. Ishii not only based his testing on individual subjects, he also launched various pathogens from airplanes to infect nearby communities. In addition, he infected water sources and crops. Ishii wanted to test the survivability of his bacteria and how quickly they could sicken entire populations. Ishii's second objective, more than research, was training. He allowed his doctors to practice vivisections on live subjects to train them in the treatment of war wounds, procedures that are too gruesome for me to describe in detail. Ishii's third goal was to test the human resistance to pain. People were locked in high-pressure chambers until their eyes fell out, or they were put in centrifuges and spun until they died. He also dedicated herself to freezing and thawing limbs to tear them off later. Ishii and his team subjected study subjects to lethal doses of X-rays, burned them with flamethrowers, exposed them to toxic gases such as mustard gas, dehydrated them to death, and injected them with animal blood and other cruelties. These experiments had no medical purpose except to cause indescribable pain to human beings. In the Japanese perception at that time, Chinese civilians were less than insects. In 1939, Ishii and his squad would operate directly with their biological weapons. At the Battle of Kokkenzhol, where the Red Army fought against the Imperial Japanese Army on the borders of Mongolia, the Japanese put large amounts of intestinal typhoid bacteria into the river. Fortunately for the Russians, this type of typhoid germ became ineffective almost immediately after falling into the water. In 1940, Japanese airplanes dropped bubonic plague-infested wheat, corn, and cotton on the village of Ningbo in China. More than 100 people died on this attacks. The Ningbo region was isolated until the 1960s. In June 1944, during the Battle of Saipan, plague-infested fleas were used again against American forces. Fortunately for them, by this stage of the war it had become almost impossible for the Japanese to obtain reinforcements or material for their island fortresses, and the Japanese submarines sank with the fleas. The same thing happened on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But these biological attacks never materialized because the planes or submarines were shot down or sunk. Even so, Ishii planned to carry out a bacteriological attack in the United States. The plan involved the use of 5 I-400 submarine carriers, each carrying 3 Aichi M6AC planes. They would be launched against San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The planes were to spread bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, and dengue over the city, while the submarine crews would become infected to disembark on a suicide mission. But the end of the war canceled this plan. The Americans had already captured some members of Squadron 731 during 1944 and discovered the horrible experiments. The idea was to prosecute Ishii and all these men, but Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders proposed to General MacArthur and President Truman to give immunity to Ishii and his group in exchange for their investigations. MacArthur and Truman approved the idea. The Cold War was in its beginnings, and the Soviet Union was the new enemy. Japan's biological and chemical weapons program remained largely secret until the 1990s. For Ishii and the members of Squadron 731, there followed a life of successful careers in the scientific, medical, or university area of post-war Japan. For many years there were reunions between members of this unit as if they were war heroes. In 1960, the infamous Dr. Ishii died from terrible throat cancer. But perhaps the suffering that he suffered for years was nothing compared to the agonies to which he subjected thousands of people. Dr. Ishii and Squad 731 caused the death of 200,000 people according to the book Death Factories. The legacy of Unit 731 is that of a useless, fanciful, extravagant, and sadistic indulgence that really achieved nothing politically or militarily for Japan and, in terms of their research, nothing for the United States, because they discovered that the squadron's infamous experiments did not contribute nothing in the scientific field. Thanks for watching the video. If you are interested in World War II content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I upload new videos every week.